Music is a human artifact, and that makes it a social phenomenon. While the constraints of physics and of human perception played some role in the development of music, it is by its very nature a social transaction. It is a gift of sound from one person to another. Music theory itself is a social transaction. It involves one person giving information about music to another. By virtue of being a social transaction, it harbors certain prejudices. These are based on the fundamental beliefs of the music theorists about what music should be and about what music theory should be. Douglas Dempster and Matthew Brown explain different approaches to music theory in their short article, Evaluating Musical Analyses and Theories, 5 Perspectives. Their categorization of different approaches helps to explain why music theory often seems so contradictory. They identified 5 different types of music theory. Number 1, music theory as a kind of science. A scientific theory should consist of 2 parts, a description of a phenomenon and an explanation of that phenomenon. A scientific music theory should not just describe music, it should explain music. This explanation should include cause and effect, and it should be predictive. This kind of music theory attempts to logically explain music in terms of the physical world, and it is often viewed as seeking the truth. Number 2, music theory as a kind of criticism. Critics present their personal views based on their own experience and knowledge. Critics often offer insight, but they don't claim to be logical or scientific. Number 3, music theory as a kind of art form. There can be artistry to explanation. A theory can itself be beautiful. Certain types of analysis can present beautiful results. Number 4, music theory is an explanation of perception. This type of music theory tries to explain music in terms of what listeners perceive. It's often similar to a scientific explanation, but concentrates on the listener's perception of the physical world rather than on the physical world itself. Number 5, music theory as an outgrowth of cultural context. Since music is a cultural artifact, it cannot be understood without taking into consideration its cultural context. Cultural history, and music history in particular, help to supply this necessary context. This kind of theory necessitates a kind of connoisseurship. Only a connoisseur has the necessary knowledge and experience to truly understand music. I would like to examine each one of these approaches and then to add a 6th approach that's not mentioned in the article. First, let's examine music theory as a science. In previous videos, I've described music theories based on natural law, but they're not really very scientific. They're actually philosophical. What I mean by that is they're not based on experimentation, they're not based on carefully collected data. For example, while Riemann and Hauptmann's theories are partially based on a real phenomenon, the overtone series, they also make use of the undertone series. The undertone series is made up. It doesn't really exist. It's based on the idea of the Hegelian dialectic. Hegel philosophized that the universe is fundamentally symmetrical, that for every phenomenon there should be some kind of opposite phenomenon. So for example, if there's an overtone series that produces major chords and major scales, then there should be an undertone series that produces minor chords and minor scales. So the idea of the undertone series is not really scientific, it's philosophical, and it's pretty unsophisticated philosophy. If we apply this literal dialectical interpretation to the natural world, we end up with things like anti-gravity, a force which opposes gravity, and a darkening force which removes illumination. It's pretty silly stuff. I'm not saying that composers couldn't make use of such ideas when composing their music. They could, for example, compose pieces based upon the undertone series, and music theorists could use the undertone series in order to explain those pieces. I'm just saying that theories such as Riemann's are not really very scientific. Unlike real science, they're not universal. The same can be said for Schinker's theories. Schinker roots his ideas in the overtone series. His fundamental concept is that there is, in the background of all great music, a chord of nature that consists of the first 5 notes of the overtone series. This chord is a major triad, and it provides the ground out of which music grows and recedes. The harmony of a work unfolds from this chord, as does the melody. This is a very powerful concept. It explains why music has a sense of motion. Both melody and harmony will not rest until they return to tonic at the end of a work. It explains why the dominant-tonic relationship is so powerful. Dominant is the lowest unique pitch in the overtone series, and it yearns to return to tonic. The theory explains why temporary modulations in classical and romantic music don't sound final. This is because the music yearns to return to the original tonic, which is not gone, but is merely lurking in the background. While Schenker's theories seem to have a foundation in natural law, they're not actually very scientific. As I mentioned earlier, scientific theories are verified through experimentation, and experiments on the perception of music tend to disprove Schenker's basic assumptions. Nicholas Cook, in his article, Musical Form and the Listener, describes informal experiments that he conducted with his students. Musically literate but inexperienced listeners were asked to write down the formal plan of Beethoven's Sonata Opus 49 No. 2 as they listened to it. Most of the listeners ignored or simply failed to perceive large-scale relationships of tonality. Even informal cursory observations contradict Schenker's theory. For example, marches by John Philip Sousa usually modulate in the middle and never return to the original key. And nobody cares. This is not to say that nobody notices. The players certainly notice. They see the key change, but they don't feel the piece yearning to return to the original tonic at the end. If listeners don't perceive the kind of large-scale mandates that Schenker describes, why is Schenkerian analysis still a thing? I think this is because Schenkerian analysis no longer fits under Category 1, Scientific Theories of Music, but rather under Dempster and Brown's third category, Music Theory as an Art Form. Behind me is a gigantic and slightly rumpled Schenker graph. I made a number of these Schenker graphs back in the 1980s in order to demonstrate the music software that I was developing. I went around to academic conferences and demonstrated the software. The idea behind the gigantic graphs was that they showed that my music printing software could do pretty much anything you wanted with musical notation, and that it could print at any size. This Schenkerian sketch was meant as eye candy, to draw the customers in. I think it worked, because Schenkerian sketches are actually aesthetically pleasing. Doing Schenkerian analysis is also a kind of art. Some of the details of any piece will fall in easily with the Schenkerian paradigm. Other details won't seem to fit, but the clever analyst can find some way to make them fit so that an explanation of the piece can be achieved. Other kinds of analysis offer a similar creative outlet. Who would deny the beauty of a neo-Riemannian tonance, particularly one mapped to a three-dimensional torus, rotating in space? Here's my version. It looks like a work of art to me. Perhaps more common than music theory as an art form is music theory as criticism. I think this might be the most honest kind of music theory because it represents the theorist's own insights and not some kind of universal truth. It also tends to stress proprietary information. I read an article a few years ago about teachers that said that 20-something% of what they teach is proprietary, meaning unique to that teacher. This is one of the reasons why teachers aren't interchangeable. And it's also a good argument against certain kinds of programmed learning and standardized tests. Music theory as criticism also makes use of proprietary information. This information is often based on some kind of insight that's unique to a particular theorist. For example, Rudolf Reti interpreted the works of Beethoven in terms of motivic transformation. Reti didn't invent motivic transformation, but he did take it to extremes, and he found transformations in Beethoven's works that no one else had. He makes it clear from the language that he uses that these are his own personal interpretations. Music theory as criticism can include actual criticism of the work of others. While Gottfried Weber does outline original approaches in his theory of musical composition, he also critiques the work of other theorists. While it might seem that most music theory should probably fall under this category, I don't think that's the intent of most music theorists. Theorists like Hindemith, Rameau, Getches, and many others will often make an appeal to natural law in order to emphasize that the theory that they teach is not their own personal opinion. The rhetoric of academic writing is such that even when something is the author's opinion, it's often presented as established fact. Here's Walter Piston on harmony and melody. The process of creating melody is hardly to be separated from that of creating harmony. Not only is it extremely rare that the composer first writes a melodic phrase without reference to its harmonic background, but melodies are most commonly derived from harmonic patterns chosen in advance. While some theorists might share his opinion on this subject, it's not an established fact, nor is it a universally held view. I, for one, would strongly disagree. Music theory as an outgrowth of cultural context is often practiced by musicologists. To put it bluntly, there's been a feud between some musicologists and some music theorists and musical practitioners since the time of the ancient Greeks. Music practitioners think that they understand music best because they can make actual musical sounds, while musicologists and some non-practicing theorists think that they understand music best because they understand its context. This feud was exacerbated in the mid-20th century by theorists and composers who took a structuralist approach. The idea was that all that is important in music is contained in the structure of the score. All that one needs to do in order to understand music is to decipher that structure. This is, of course, absurd. Music is a cultural artifact, and it cannot be understood outside its cultural context. On the other hand, I think the structuralists do have a valid point. Musicologists often stray pretty far away from the music itself when they start talking about politics and the social aspects of music. Musicologists sometimes make the sociology more important than the music. When cultural context intersects with the music itself, it can be enlightening. For example, you can't understand the classical symphony without understanding the minuet. You can't understand the music without understanding the dance that it accompanies. Early music specialist Christopher Hogwood reported that the minuet was the most popular part of the symphony in the 18th century. This seems strange to many of us. I myself find that I get bored during classical minuets, and I find it hard to believe that people in the 18th century would have been fascinated by them. But Hogwood made a strong case for cultural context. The audiences of the time knew the dance intimately, so they could appreciate the little changes and witticisms that a composer like Joseph Haydn added into his minuets. We can't understand the music in the same way because we don't have the same context. In fact, you might say that we can't understand the music at all unless we gain a knowledge of the dance that it's based on. So it's important that we understand the approach of the music theorist. If we don't understand the agenda of the messenger, how can we properly interpret the message? The point of examining all of these different approaches is that understanding music theorists' approaches helps us to understand their motivations, their agendas. In spite of appearances, very little human expression is neutral. There's always a reason why music theorists write about music. They always have a point of view, an agenda, and it helps us to evaluate their work if we can determine what that agenda is. Throughout this series of videos, I've been using an approach that's not mentioned by Dempster or Brown, pedagogical music theory. Historically, most music theory texts have been of this type. Music theory teachers also have agendas, and they're not always high-minded. For example, music theory teachers must present material that can be assessed, graded. Why do we spend so much time in music theory class dealing with things like parallel fifths? Is it because they're vitally important, or because they're easy to identify, easy to grade? Students often complain that music's not nearly as cut and dried in real life as it is portrayed in music theory textbooks. However, if music theory textbooks presented a more nuanced view of music, it would make it harder for music theory teachers to tell students that they're wrong. Educational institutions want objective assessment. Music theory textbooks assist this process.